So for this specific challenge, the palindrome, it says in this exercise, you will create a component that allows users to input a word and acknowledge to them whether or not the word is a palindrome, spelled the same forward and backwards. So we've already kind of created this. I think we already had this challenge like early on in like week 1 or 2. So we pretty much already have that algorithm created, whether it's in Python or JavaScript. You can convert it to JavaScript but you should have it already done in JavaScript. So it says release 0, create your input text box. Create a UI that has a text input with an on-change event listener attached to it. So I've got this input. Cool, whatever. All right. Here is my palindrome. I've already cloned it. I've already did npx create React app palindrome. I already did that because it does take a little while for everything to install. So I already kind of did that, so we don't have to sit here and wait for everything to install. So I've got my source. So let's kind of like walk through. I initially created this. So we've got our node modules, our public, and our source directory. We have a git ignore, which already has a lot of dependencies. These node modules, I don't know what this is. No idea. Coverage, test, okay. We have a production. Okay, we have some other stuff. Cool. The biggest thing you don't want to throw up when you add stuff is definitely don't want to include node modules. It's so large. We have our package.json file, which we should be pretty familiar with. Here it's named palindrome. We have some other things. We have our dependencies. So in addition to React, React DOM, and React Script, it included this testing library, Jest DOM, React DOM, user event DOM. I've never used these before. We're not going to be touching these at all. And then in our scripts, we have a start, which we initially run to npm start to run the server and run our app. We have build, we have test, and eject. npm build is a script you want to actually build your application and create that Webpack or that bundle.js file and your Babel, all that stuff. And you want to make a build of your application when you deploy it to, Amazon or, DigitalOcean or some other where you actually want to deploy your application. Test is probably how to run scripts or you run your tests. I don't know what eject does. Never used it before. Then here's that browser list. Yep.
It basically lets you handle all the configuration outside of what Create React App has said is the best way to configure, like Webpack and Babel. So it lets you customize those things.
Eject does? Or which one?
Yep. And then you're responsible for maintaining your own Webpack configs after that.
Cool. Nice. And then let's go into public. So this is your public where a lot of your static files are. We have our favicon, which is that. We have our index.html file. So if you look in our index.html, it has pretty much the same thing. It's got some other things. It's got our title, create React app. And then it has this no script. You need to enable JavaScript to run this app. Okay. Then here's our root. And that's pretty much it. So we kind of already did that. Then we have some logos. And then we have this manifest JSON. This just has some additional configuration with regards to this specific app. Now let's go into source. Source is where all the magic happens. So in here, we have our index.js. We have some CSS. We have our app component, which is also right here. We have this service worker. This is specific to create React app. It's not necessary, but it says if you want your app to work offline and load faster, you can change unregistered to register below. Note that this comes with some pitfalls. Learn more about blah, 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 blah. Don't really ever use that. And in here, we have a React strict mode. that is encapsulating our app component. So this React strict mode is pretty new. It essentially provides some additional user information in the dev tools about certain things that, some like warnings and certain things that your app may have in it that, you know, might have some functionality in it that might be slowly deprecated from React, and also like some React libraries that you might install. They like it kind of gives a diagnostic of like the if there's any warnings or if anything's being deprecated. It's not, you don't necessarily need it here, but Create React App gives it to you, so we might as well leave it. We're not going to touch anything in here. Now let's go to our React app. So what else do we have? We have our index CSS, which is just more CSS, our app CSS, which is our CSS for our app, JS. We have our logo, which is an SVG. What does SVG stand for? Scalable Vector Grid? I don't know, something like that.
Graphics.
Oh, scalable Vector Graphics, thank you. And then we have that server worker and setup tests, which we won't be touching. So in our app.js, let's go ahead and start this application, npm start. That start script is coming from our package.json, which is right here, which calls a React script start. So npm start, see it run. All right. Slowly starting. All right, compiled successfully. You can now view Palindrome in the browser. So here's our Create React App. This is like the default Create React App component. So let's scroll that down here. Let's zoom in a little bit. So in our Palindrome, it says create a UI that has a text input. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of this except for that one enclosing div right here. I'm going to keep that here. I'm going to delete this logo because I'm not using that logo anymore. Great. So this is what is called a functional component. There are two types of components. There are class-based components and functional-based components. When React first started out, it was primarily class-based components in addition to functional-based components, but they want now going forward, React is gearing away from class-based components and really just wants to stick with functional-based components. Initially, class-based components had a lot more functionality, but with recent upgrades and newer versions of React, they extended that capability to functional-based components. So now functional-based components pretty much has all the same capabilities as class-based components. When I go through these challenges, I'll create them in functional-based components. And then if there's time, I'll create it as a class-based component as well, just kind of show you what they look like side by side. So function app, you can easily also do const app equals, use like a fat arrow function. It's the same thing. I'll go back just to keep it the same. So the first thing we want to do is create an input tag. So let's just create an H1. It says, is this a palindrome? With a question mark. I'm going to go back here. It says, is this a palindrome? And now I'm going to create there's a couple of ways we can do this. Should I create a form, an on-submit form? Or what should we do? Yeah, I'm going to create a form. Form. So I've got a form. I've got an input. And the input tag kind of looks like a component where it doesn't have a closing tag. So I've got input. The type is a text. Let's just see what that looks like. Cool. I'm going to open up my dev tools in my console. I'm going to say, okay, whatever. So I'm just going to actually console log this app component. I'm going to say mounted, just to see if this prints off in the console. And there it goes. So that means when I say mounted, it's mounting this component to the DOM. So in this input, let's see what the actual thing says. It says with an on change event listener. Don't know what that means. On change React. React on change event handler. I have a component like this with a handle change, handling on change. Where does it say that? So I've got this on change and this input. I'm just going to throw that in there. So it's got an on change attribute. And then in my on change, I've got this handle change, which is a method. And we're using functional based components. So I'm going to write a event so I'm going to console log typing handle change. All right, let's see if this works. So am I getting errors? Handle change is assigned a value but is never used. Why isn't it never used?
I don't think you want this.
Oh, yep, I don't want this. I only want to use this when I'm dealing with class-based components. So let's look at what this looks like. So I've got that console log mounted, which is on line 5. And now when I type in this thing, it's going to have this on change event handler is going to execute this method. So anytime I type into this input, it's going to execute this handle change. It's going to come in here. It's going to take in an event, and it should console log typing a bunch of times. So there it goes. It says typing, typing. It said typing a bunch of times. But I want to actually grab the value from this input. So I can do, say, in event target dot value. Let's see if I can actually console log what am I typing. Race car. So it's executing that handle change function every time something in the input changes. So when I delete it, it executes it. If I add something, I can add numbers, do a bunch of stuff. So, all right, I've got that down. It said once a user types something in your text box, it captures what they type, referencing the value of the text input field. All right, through the event object okay. And then it says we're going back to week 1, so now we have to write our palindrome function. I'm just going to console log or copy and paste my palindrome function from week 1. It's called reversed word. It takes in a word and, let's actually delete that before I get into that. So I've got this handle change, this event.target.value. But when I look in my React app and I go to my components, it doesn't have state anywhere in here. Can anybody tell me what the term state represents?
Saved variable or saved value in memory.
So it's a saved value in memory. Okay, yep, continue.
I saw a description that said you can think of state as any data that should be saved and modified without having to add it to a database.
Yep, that works. Yeah, I like that. So does anybody else have anything? Yeah. So state is essentially data that is going to exist inside of this specific component. And React has a very specific way of how to assign a value to state. And it depends on whether you're using functional-based components or class-based components. So class-based components, you declare state differently than how you declare state using functional-based components. So within functional-based components, how we declare state, we use what is called a useState hook. So as React is evolving to move away from class-based components, and they're incorporating features or the capabilities of class-based components into functional-based components. In doing so, they've created what are called hooks. Hooks are ways to declare state, update your component at certain times. Also, there's multiple different types of hooks. So we're going to be using the useState hook currently. There's also useEffect, there's useContext, there's other types of hooks, but we're mainly going to be using the useState hook. And the useState hook is a method or a function that returns two values. It actually returns two things. It returns an array of the initial state value as well as a function that enables you to update the state. Because like in the detention method or detention challenge, we tell you, you never want to directly manipulate state and props directly. You need to use functions to do that. And one of those functions is returned from the useState hook. So I'm just going to delete that mounted. I could say const. So the useState hook returns two values, as I said. Returns the initial state value as well as a function that enables you to update the state. So we can use array destructuring to capture those two values that are returned. And we can say, is palindrome, or what should I call it? What should be the initial state of whether or not this palindrome is? Word and set word. So useState, I'm going to have it be an empty string. So I created a variable essentially called word, and that's going to represent our state for this component. And the initial state of word, or the initial value of word, is an empty string. So this useState function returns two values. It returns the word, which is the initial state, as well as a function called setWord, that's what I'm calling it, that gives us the ability to update word. Because we never want to directly update word just by doing word equals something. We always want to do it like the way React wants us to, which is using the setWord function. What questions do you have about state and useState?
All right, so in that construct there, I mean, it's kind of like a standard assign statement. So what's on the right is going to be used to populate what's on the left. As you said, the array goes into word and the function goes into setWord.
Correct. So yeah, like this initial value that I'm passing in as useState is this initial value. So if I change this, so hold on, if I console log word and refresh it, go to console, can't even see anything. So it says word and it's an empty value right here.
Right. So like put something in the word in the use state. So like just like a letter, right?
Yep. So like now if I go back, it sets that initial value to that. And then it also, this use state also returns a function that we declared is called setWord that we use to update this value.
But we're not doing anything here to define that.
Correct. Well, we're defining, like, we're not, wait, say that one more time.
I mean, I don't see anything here in our commands that is defining what function activity setWord does.
Correct. Yeah. So that's what use state automatically creates that function for us. But we just kind of declare like what the name of that function is.
Okay. And so when you're using setWord, it's basically just saying take that array and don't do anything to it, and you get that array.
Well, it doesn't say the array. So this array. So let me see something. So I can set use state. Was someone going to say something?
Yeah, I think tuple or tuple would be a more appropriate word for that rather than array.
Oh. So if I say like, if I assign that to some value and I console log some value at index 0, some value at index 1. It's actually, so how it says like, so right here, the initial value. So use state returns an array, or yeah, I would say returns two values, the initial value as well as a function. And if I can access those values by grabbing the index, so index 0 of some value, let's make it L. That initial value is L. And if I wanted to grab the function that is also returned, I can grab the index at 1, and here's that function. That's what this is what it looks like.
Okay, so it's a 2-element array. The first element. You go back to the code. Like, could you put LKM as a use state of L, comma?
What do you want me to put here?
Like put three different letters. Well, but as separate parts of an array. Or is that?
Oh, like enter in an array?
Yeah, I guess.
So yeah, so the initial value of this. So the initial value will be an array of letters. So right here.
The initial value is an array of letters. Okay, right.
So right there. But if I wanted just to be like a number, an object, or anything. See, oh, looks like. Oh yeah, because it doesn't have a key. So yeah, so right now the initial value is an object with a keyword val of an array, and then the other thing that's returned at the first index is a function. And in order to access that, I'm going to say word is the first index, or word. This value I'm going to assign to a variable called word, because that's what kind of that is, as well as a set word. So I'm going to define this variable as the function, this specific function right here. It's called array destructuring. So this gives me access to the initial value and the function that enables me to update this function or this word variable. I don't know if that kind of helped or not.
I can take a stab at it. So, okay, what we have here is regular assignment operator equals. UseState is a function and you're passing one parameter to it. So that function gets evaluated and then it returns two items in an array. One of the first element in that array is the initial value. And the second element is an actual function, which is now your setter, which is how you set that value instead of modifying it directly. So breaking it out with word and set word is how you can access those two elements independently with separate identifiers rather than word 0 and word 1, which word 1 would be your function name, which you would invoke that with word 1 parentheses, and word 0 would still be your initial value, but those aren't really descriptive.
I have a follow-up question, actually. You might have already mentioned this and I missed it, but the second argument, the one that's the function, is it just like an anonymous function that has yet to be named and you're just kind of setting it, you're assigning that function to set word?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Got it. Thank you.
And it's good.
So that word is still to be, we're putting a placeholder in, but we haven't defined it yet.
Yes, we have defined it. So the UseState returns an array, and this part of the array is literally just like an anonymous function. So let's go back. So that set word is the function at this index of the return value of UseState. So if I come here, I'm setting that set word variable to equal this function.
It's like UseState knows that you're going to want a function, so it gives you an anonymous function, anonymous being it doesn't have a name yet, but you're actually giving it the name that it's going to have by doing the destructuring of the array. The second item, you're giving it the name of set
word.
Yeah, whatever Tom called it.
Yeah. So as Julian said, this UseState returns two values. The first value is the initial. It returns an array of two values. The value at index 0, which is the initial value that I passed in, and then the value at index 1 is that function, the anonymous function right here, this like big thing. And when I do array destructuring, I grab that first value, or I grab the value at index 0 and I assign it to the variable word. And then I grab the value at index 1, which is that function, and I assign it to the variable set word.
So that function is like I think of a function as being, okay, take a value and add 4 to it. That's a function does it. So it's not really that kind of function. It's just kind of a function that, like, where did it come up with all the stuff that you showed in the inspector?
It came from, so right here, like this stuff.
Like if argument equals 3 equals function error.
Oh,
where's all that come from? Is that from the UseState default?
Yeah, so that's what's returned from the UseState function. I don't know, like that's just React in React, how that it has this function that's already built in. So yeah, so that's like behind the scenes. It's
sort of like a behind the scenes function that just does the populating, and we don't really have to work. You're not going to use it to do math or to take a mode or to do anything with it.
Nope, it's specifically to set the value of the state.
The best way I think I can think about it when I was asking it is it's generating anonymous function setters for you that they don't have a name yet until you give it the name. So when you do the destructuring where Tom on line 5 has set word, UseState, the second argument in the array that it returns, it's an anonymous function that is already some kind of setter for the first value, but it doesn't have the name set word as the function name until that destructuring happens. And then that's when the anonymous function becomes like a named function. That's how I am understanding it.
Yeah, that function is strictly to manipulate and change the value of this word.
But it's not really, I can see how it's accessing. It's not really manipulating it in any way yet, right?
Yeah, right now, yeah, no. But if I want to manipulate word, which is a value as an empty string, I'll have to call set word. So let's continue. So if I can console log the word, so it says set word is assigned a value but never used. So I'm console logging word out here, but nothing's displaying. But if I want to change the value, I can call set word event.target.value. So every time this function is called, I'm reassigning, or not reassigning, I'm updating this variable's value. So if I type it again, now this is being displayed, which is down here. So the set word is updating the word value, or updating state, as they say. All right. So now I can include my palindrome.
Tom, can you go back to that? I'm sorry. Where you had console log of Word. So I saw Noah do this yesterday, and I think I got a little confused. So if there's a function that's taking a state variable, does it automatically run every time the state changes? So like, how does console log Word
change every
know?
time?
Yeah,
So
how does it know to execute every single time that word has changed?
So your components will re-render every time state or props change. So every
Okay.
time I press this button or enter in something here, it's going to re-render the app component.
So what it does is it updates Word, and then it literally reruns everything.
Yeah, it re-renders this portion. Yeah.
Okay.
Because it doesn't like refresh the screen or anything.
Okay.
Is that because you set an on change? Because every time you press a key, the on change function will run? Down in your line 17.
So it's this function, this handle change, that's updating state. And no matter what, anytime state updates within your component, it's going to re-render.
Well, so if you had other functions that took Word as a argument, they would all also rerun every time state changed?
Yes.
Automatically. Like it's built in, like we don't have to do anything extra?
As long as the data flow executes that function.
Okay.
But usually you want like some event handler, like an on-change event handler or on submit to run.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And this is one of the this is honestly the biggest frustration when working in React is the re-render, the life cycle, as they say, of the component. But we're going to get to that in the coming days and next week, as well as working with data flow and props and all that. So with that, let's continue. Whoop. I'm going to copy and paste my this is my palindrome tester thing. And I got, let's create another, well, how do I want to do this? Actually, I'm going to create a form. Well, I guess we can do it this way, and then I'll create a form to submit it. So I've got the word. I'm going to also take in, let's see, hold on. by taking a word length, set input, I'm trying to think of how I want to do this. I can create a form or I can just do it dynamically. Which way do you guys want me to go?
Dynamic, definitely.
Dynamic, definitely. So I've got this set word. So then let's see, let's look at the example. It says, going back to week 1, set state on your component, say whether or not your input palindrome is a palindrome and display that out to the screen. So do I even need to set the word to state, or can I just set a Boolean value like const is palindrome kind of thing, set is pal equals use state, the initial value is false?
I was wondering that when you were making the word first. I was like, wouldn't you just need the Boolean? But I don't really know any of this. So
I'll do it both ways. I'll do it on just dynamically as well as use a form, just to kind of show you what a form looks like. Just so you kind of see what that looks like as well. So I've got this on event handler change, and I don't even need to set the word. I can call reversed word event dot target dot value, and then instead of set input, I can say set is palindrome is false. So what's going on is I'm typing into this input box. It's running through this on change of handle change function. It's coming up here, handle change. It takes in the event, console logs. I'm going to delete that right now. And it's passing that event.target value into reversed word. It takes in the word, it replaces any spaces, removes any spaces. Says if the word doesn't have a length, set the is palindrome, this is the is pal state to false. Else kind of just do this portion of this, which if it loops through it, this is like the test whether or not it's a palindrome, and it returns a true or false of whether or not it's a palindrome. So I can test it just by doing console logging is pal. So it's giving me some things like word is assigned a value never used. Okay, that's fine for right now. If I refresh, clear. So it's initially, I don't know, initially it's undefined. Let's refresh that. So initially it's false. If I type in, so it's re-rendering a bunch of times. And if I actually race car, then it turns true. So initially it's false. Now if I do like an E, it's going to turn to false. Evil olive. So it's false right now. The initial state is false. Now if I do an E, type in an E to make it a palindrome, it should say true. There we go. Okay, so I've got my thing working. I'm going to delete some console logs. I can actually delete this part for now. And if I come down here in the palindrome, it says, say whether or not your input is a palindrome and display that out to the screen. So I'll have to do, so each component always returns JSX, which is, looks exactly like HTML, there's some minute changes that are kind of annoying, like class name instead of just class, but it allows us to also do inline JavaScript, kind of like Jinja. So I can do inline JavaScript by doing curly braces, and I can write inline JavaScript in here. And I can do some dynamic rendering to the screen. So in JavaScript, I'm going to use a ternary operator that says is palindrome or is pal, which is the state of whether or not this is a palindrome. It's going to return a Boolean value. So it says if is pal is true, which so if this is true, question mark, H1, I'm going to say true, else false. So if I render it, so if I go back to the screen, is pal is initially false, I should have false displayed to the screen. So there's false. And if I say like Tom, whoop, so Tom is not a palindrome. If I do race car, turns to true. If I do evil olive, turns to true. So there we got some dynamic rendering now. So that's pretty much palindrome. Let's go ahead and create a quick form and do this, but instead of just doing this handle change, let's create a form with a button in it. So I don't even need, I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to use this set is pal. See what this looks like. So I've got this reversed word. I'm going to create a function called, let's see. So I've got this input form. I'm going to create a button. Submit. Let's refresh it. I'm going to get rid of this handle on changed. This is kind of what a form with a submit button might look like. So I've got a submit. And since this button is encapsulated in this form, the submit button is associated with that specific form. Type equals submit. And then this form has another attribute called onSubmit, and it's going to execute the isPalindrome method that I have yet to create. So I come up here, I'm going to create const isPalindrome. Takes in an event. Okay. So when I submit this, so I'm just going to test it out right now. If I console log submitted, it refreshes all right away, but I see it like display right here. Submitted, but it refreshes. How do I prevent the web page from refreshing?
You got to prevent default.
What's that?
Event.prevent default.
Event.prevent default. So this event prevent default prevents this form default behavioral like refreshing right away. So if I refresh and click there, so it didn't refresh, there it says submitted. Now I can grab the word, the input word. How do I grab the input word from this input text?
If input or const input equals event.target.value.
Event.target.value. Let's console log input word. So if I type it, it says undefined. So if we go back when we initially had an onChange event handler, we were able to access the value from this input because we had an onChange event handler attached to this specific input tag. But since we don't have an onChange event handler anywhere, we can't, it doesn't know what it's targeting. So what we can do is assign a name attribute to input word. I'll just say like word right now, or input value. So I'm assigning name to this, and now I can access that specific value in the target or in that specific input by doing input value dot value. So if I do that, oh no, what happened? Cannot read property value of undefined. Oh, word value. See if that works. There we go. So I've got the input word, and now I can just return the reverse word input word. And now that returning that reversed word, it's running through here, it's updating the state of whether or not that palindrome is a palindrome or not. So if I say Tom, it's not, I click submit. But if I do race car, click submit, it turns to true. If I put in race care, false. Evil olive, submit is true. And lastly, I just kind of want to show you something. Up until this point, we've been putting buttons within the forms. You can actually remove the button from the form. But now, this form, there's nothing connecting this button to this form anymore. So if I refresh, I can say like that and submit it. There's nothing connecting this button to the form. In order to do that, we can add an ID to this form called like submit palindrome. And now in the button, I can actually say, hey, this specific form I'm using for this button is the submit palindrome form. So now I can link this, that's how I link this button to this specific form. So if I refresh it, say Tom or race car, submit it, it works. Still works.
Is there any reason why you would want to disassociate the button from the form?
I've done it for design purposes because I didn't want my button at the very, like, I didn't want my, like, for example, here, I wanted like something in between the input as well as some design pattern or some design in between the form and my submit button. Just in case you ever encounter that, if you like come up with a design where your button is disassociated with your form, there is a way to get that to work.
Would an alternative be to be something with an event handler with the button? So like on click, and then it calls and basically simulates a submit for that particular form within that event?
So if there's like an event handler, like an on submit.
Yeah, and then that would pull up a function that would do some type of action, and within that action, it's basically calls the other element, the form element, and then calls its submit method. Would that be? I mean, I imagine it's complex, but that was my first kind of thought of how to kind of link them together.
I've never tried that. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. All right. All right. Does anybody have any questions about Palindrome. Nope. All right, let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, and we'll jump into what is it, state abbreviator. And in state abbreviator, I'll actually do it in both class-based and functional-based components.